All right, go ahead and open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 14. We're going to be looking there at, that's not what it was supposed to do. There we go. Number 83, Herod orders the execution of John the Baptist. Here in Matthew chapter 14, 6 through 12, and then Mark chapter 6, 17 through 19. We kind of read through this here in Mark chapter 6 a little bit a couple weeks ago as we were kind of setting up here with the events with Jesus sending out his disciples to preach and to heal. But let's take Matthew chapter 14 tonight and see if we get back into Mark in a little bit. And I need to turn over there myself. All right, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He's been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him." For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." And though he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people because they held him to be a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod, so that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter." And the king was sorry, but because of his oaths and his guest, he commanded it to be given. He sent and had John beheaded in prison. And his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. And his disciples came and took the body and buried it, and they went and told Jesus. Okay, anything here before I begin? I figured that was about to happen. I kept getting a notification here on my tablet that something was going on. Try this one more time. If it fails again, we'll go the old-fashioned way. Any questions or comments here before we go on? All right, starting back up at the beginning, chapter 14 and verse 1. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus. Obviously, this is a different Herod than the Herod that had the young boys slaughtered in Bethlehem at the time of Jesus' birth. He said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He's been raised from the dead, and that is why these miraculous powers are at work in him." You know, Jesus is here, and previous to this, in Nazareth, and we know that he's sending out his chosen. He's sending them out into the area, the 2x2, the limited commission we've talked about the last couple weeks, and all these different things are going on, but Jesus has all this fame, and so Herod is saying, there's got to be something to this. There's no way that this has to be John the Baptist. He's come back from the dead. That's why these miraculous powers are at work in him. And then we see the fate of John the Baptist. And it's kind of interesting that in a very small way, in a very, very, very small method, John predicted what was going to happen to him. He said that he must increase and I must decrease. And as the story continues to go on, we find John playing a very little role. In fact, after Jesus' baptism, we only see John the Baptist twice. We find him in prison, and he sends to Jesus and asks, "Are you the Messiah? Are you the Christ?" And then after that, here we find the death of John. So once the gospel story begins to take place and Jesus is baptized, his earthly ministry begins there in Judea, then John the Baptist quickly begins to fade out of the scene. I mean, we're talking about 18 months here. This is not years that John the Baptist fame starts to dwindle and then Jesus comes in. No, it's almost as soon as Jesus is baptized by John that John's work is over. Now, being John and who he is, he's probably going about and preaching. He's probably going about and telling people about Jesus and still doing his best to pave the way, but that is starting to fade out of the picture. And the gospel writers don't carry his work on. They focus more upon Jesus, but here in just a short amount of time, John the Baptist is off the scene. His work is over and his life is ended. But before we talk about the way that his life ends, let's think about that for a moment. You know, it's John the Baptist's life is pretty short. He's only 6 months older than Jesus, who at this time is probably in his early 30s, somewhere around there. 30 to 33 is kind of when his ministry is, as best as we can tell. So John the Baptist is really, he's only about 6 months older than Jesus, according to the gospel story, and his life is done at this point. He has been given as a promised child to accomplish a purpose. And Jesus says that there is none greater born among women than John the Baptist. His purpose was to pave the way for Christ. His purpose was to prepare the way, to make straight paths for the Lord, to bulldoze down the mountains, to fill in the valleys, so we have a straight road, to build the path that is going to lead to salvation. There really is no greater purpose in life that a man could have been given than to prepare the way for Jesus Christ, to prepare the people for his coming, to prepare them for the time that this old covenant that the Jews had is going to come to an end. That all of these things are going to come to pass, they're going to be fulfilled, that Christ is going to come, and salvation for the world is going to come through him. And that's ultimately what his message was, and he accomplishes his task. It kind of, as we said, culminates there with the baptism of Jesus is kind of the handing off point, if you will, where John the Baptist hands off the ministry to Jesus. Jesus picks it up and then goes throughout the nation of Israel and eventually ends up on the cross to accomplish and finalize the scheme of redemption. But the one to have put that into play, the one to have put that into action, if you will, was John the Baptist. Let's go over to John chapter 1 real quick. John chapter 1. And I want to read all the way down through, probably to about verse 14 here. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness, to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and yet the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become the children of God, who were born not of blood, nor the will of flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory is of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. All right, so verse 15, John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me." And this before me is not time. This is position. He ranks higher than me, it could be translated. He ranks before me. He is higher than I am. He ranks above me. He's of a higher status. He's of a higher bloodline. Everything about him is greater than I am. John even says, and I'm not even, depending on the translation and the account, I'm not even worthy to either untie or to carry his sandals. I'm not even worthy to touch his shoes. For a Jew, that makes them what? Unclean. If he were to take the shoes, take those sandals, it would make him unclean. I'm not even worthy to make myself unclean in his service by doing those things. So John the Apostle writes not just about Jesus Christ here at the very beginning of his gospel, but also a very good commendation for John the Baptist, who came before Jesus Christ, who came to prepare the way, the voice of one crying in the wilderness. Now, I think it's rather unfortunate that so many of the paintings, and I know they're just iconography, whatever, that so many of the paintings present John the Baptist as a very feminine man. And it could not be any further from the truth. This was a rugged individual. Like Jesus said, who did you go out to see? You know, this is a bruised reed. This is not a handsome man. This is a rugged man. He wore camel's hair. He ate locusts and wild honey. This was a man who was dedicated to his task. He's out in the wilderness. He's out teaching and preaching wherever he can. He's near Aenon because there's much water there in John chapter 3. He is doing everything he can to accomplish his task. And when his task is done, it's kind of like his life is over as well. You know, his purpose on earth is over, and God takes him. Now, it is in a brutal way, and it's amazing how John the Baptist he's not even afraid to shy away from telling the king that the king is in the wrong. He is dedicated to his mission, to prepare the way for Christ. It is not lawful for you to have her, he says about his wife. So John the Baptist is not ashamed at all to carry the message. Like Paul says in Romans chapter 1 and verse 16, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God for everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greeks. The power of God to salvation, Romans chapter 1 and verse 16. So here with John the Baptist, like we said, it really does seem kind of tragic that once his mission is over, his life is over. That it was to be something so short. I mean, I'm probably have outlived John the Baptist by this point. His life is done. But look at everything that life accomplished. He gave his life to accomplish his mission, and he did. Just like the Apostle Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 4. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course, and I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day, not only to me, but unto everyone that loves his appearing. I have won, Paul says. And John the Baptist is the exact same way. He won the race. He finished the course. He won the fight. So even though his life, what it seems like is a very tragic life, that it ends so short, but he accomplished so much in that this would bring about the salvation for the world. He made it where Jesus Christ could come in. Everything is set up. He picks up at the baptism. He takes the ministry of John and he transfers it into his own ministry, and he carries on in the momentum that John has produced and leads all the way to the cross. Now, both of these cousins end up dying in really horrific ways. Both of them end up accomplishing their mission. Really, only about a year and a half apart from each other. Born half a year apart, and they die about a year and a half apart. But they both accomplish what God had set out for them. And nothing greater could be said. Honestly, nothing greater could be said about either one of these men, that they did what God had given them to do. And we have to wonder if that can be said of us at the end of our life, that we have accomplished what we set out to do, that we accomplished what God wanted us to do. We have found and fulfilled God's will for our lives. Both of them, John and Jesus, both carried that out to the fullest, all the way out to paying the ultimate price in giving their life for the cause of the kingdom of God. We may not have to face that. Most likely, we won't have to face that. But they were willing to do it at any cost. What cost are we willing to pay in order that we would accomplish? So John is he's been seized, he's bound, and he's put in prison because of his preaching, not for any misdeeds, not for any law breaking, not for any sins or transgressions, but simply because he made the king mad. Simply because he was willing to stand up for the truth and say, this is not right. You should not be doing this. And the king has him thrown into prison. Now, he doesn't want to put him to death, he wanted to put him to death, but he's afraid to put him to death because of the people. The people think he's a prophet. The people think he's a man of God. You cannot put this man to death. And Herod understands what that would do. The revolt that would happen if he killed somebody who they held to be a prophet. Now, his fears obviously didn't come to pass because he ultimately does kill the prophet and nothing happens. But he's afraid of his position. You know, if he loses, if Jerusalem, Judea, Israel, whatever, falls into chaos, the Romans are coming after him. You know, and that's not what you want. Above all, that's not what you want, is the Romans to come after you for your position. So he's afraid of that. Afraid of the people because they held him to be a prophet. But when his birthday comes, the daughter of Herodias dances before the company and pleases Herod. He promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. It's also added in another place, up to half of the kingdom. You know, a large amount here. And but prompted by Herodias, she says, give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter. And the king was sorry. But because of his oaths and his guests, he commanded it to be given. You know, because of the foolish gesture that he had made, the promise that he had made. And, you know, we kind of get the idea that had the guests not been there and witnessed those things, he probably would have backed out of it. But peer pressure caused him to give in, even to the point of taking another man's life. Now, not that any of the Herods would worry about blood on their hands, not that they'd be worried about that. He's obviously, again, more worried about his position than he is about anything else. So he's not worried about blood on his hands and taking another man's life. This man has already killed some of his own brothers. So he's not worried about that. But because of the oath and his guests, he commanded it to be given. He had John beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. And his disciples came and took the body and buried it, and they went out and told Jesus. So Herod falls to peer pressure. And while that's not really the point of the story at all, just a note about that, when we know that something is right, it doesn't matter who is telling us to go against it. When we know that something is right. Not falling into the peer pressure. All right, let's go over to Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6, verse 17 through 29. Again, same thing here, same story. Herod hears of it. Well, verse 14, King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some said, John the Baptist, has been raised from the dead. And that is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. They think that this is, again, John the Baptist come back. Others said he's Elijah. Others said he's a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he says, John, whom I have beheaded, has been raised. And again, we have the almost the exact same thing there. Verse 19, Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to put him to death, but she could not, because Herod feared John, knowing he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. So Herod is listening to John the Baptist. He recognizes that in some way this is a godly, righteous man. He recognizes that the people recognize him as such. And then here we have this opportunity when Herod on his birthday gave a banquet for his nobles and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. And when the daughter comes in and dances, she pleased Herod and his guests. And Herod said to the girl, ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you. And he vowed to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half of my kingdom. And so she goes out and asks her mother, for what should I ask? And she said, the head of John the Baptist. And she came in immediately with haste to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And then again in verse 26, because of his oaths and guests, he did not want to break his word to her. So immediately he sends the executioner with orders to bring John's head, and he went and beheaded him in prison and brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl, and the girl to her mother. So kind of the same story, just a couple other little details sprinkled in here and there. Brother Bob?
It doesn't have to do with the lesson, but the way it doesn't. But I was just sitting here thinking about what John did. He preached that he shouldn't have his brother's wife. He lived in adultery with him. And I guess you saw that bill that passed at Canadian Parliament on March 25th, 2026.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
About better defining what is called hate speech. It now removes the exemption of faith.
Right.
Okay? And what that means is people that are using the Bible and quoting scripture, teaching traditional views on marriage and sexuality can now be arrested and prosecuted. Now, it hasn't passed a sin, so it's kind of questionable, but it looked like it is.
Right.
So the question now becomes, with that going on just north of the border, I can tell you this stuff has a trickle down effect, okay? Not today, not tomorrow, not next week. So what I'm saying is we better get like John the Baptist and get ourselves ready to stand. You know, it's sad. I guess you saw the last Sunday, the world called it Palm Sunday, there's been a big persecution going on of so-called Christians in Nigeria by the Islamic community. Thousands over the past few years have been killed. Villages burned, schools burned, children beheaded. Sunday 56 more so-called Christians because they were celebrating Palm Sunday in a village outside of Lagos, which is people put it up in the northern part of it, were killed. So, John the Baptist was a bold man, and this was a Roman culture. But you know, he had respect for Herod, I realize that. That just goes to show you a lot of times that if you will stand on what you believe, people may not like it, but they'll respect it.
Right.
Now, he opened his big mouth, okay? And I can tell you right now, I'm like you, he could have took that back. But he was king, and you had all the guest staff and all over the kingdom, them sheriffs and them prime ministers and them mayors and them religious leaders. You find yourself in a box.
Right.
With his mouth. You can do that. But I'm just thinking about that, about how he preached that, and about how this is going on to our
Right.
neighbors to the north, you know?
Well, it wasn't a couple years ago that something very similar to that happened down in Texas.
Yeah,
Where-
well, he did.
One, maybe more ministers were arrested
Yep.
for preaching on certain topics. So, I mean, and that was Texas.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's floating around the edge, especially
Yeah.
when you see the political climate changing in this country like it is. It was real interesting looking at the stats, that's going on in Europe with all the, illegal migration from other countries. England right now, 6.5% of their gross population, combined both illegal and Muslims, is 6.5% of the population, which puts, I think they said around 3.5 million people.
yeah,
Getting significant. France is about the same.
right.
That's why they can't speak out anymore about this stuff.
Mhm.
They don't let the gate down.
Right.
You're gonna have to, so, but as far as us, we're going to stand for the truth. We better get ready. We better arm ourselves. We better know the book. You know? And I'm not a prophet, I'm actually not I'm an optimist, not a pessimist.
Right.
We travel and meet people from other countries and work with people. You know, there's a lot of good folks out there.
Right.
But you're gonna have to stand some point in time. I won't say it won't happen in my lifetime. I've seen more happen in the past 25 years than I would thought I'd see in a lifetime,
Right.
you know? But he did, he stood, which I was
He stood.
surprised to be that.
Right. Now, we've already looked there at number 84, that Herod wonders if Jesus is the resurrected John the Baptist. So let's go over to Luke chapter 9 and just catch that real quick, just for the sake of thoroughness, since we've already looked at the others. What verse was that? 7 through 9. All right, again there, that's the limited commission. And then now when Herod the Tetrarch heard what was happening, he was perplexed because it was said by some that John had been raised from the dead, by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the prophets of old had risen. And Herod said, John I beheaded, but who is this about whom I hear such things? And he sought to see him. So as all of this is happening here, and it's not just the miracles that Jesus has performed, but John had his own disciples. John had his own people that were going out and helping to spread the message and teach and to preach. And so now here's Jesus doing the same thing. Very similar. Looks very much the same. And so today, I guess we would call it like a copycat. You know, here's now Jesus risen up, and now he's doing the same thing that John the Baptist was doing. So what's going on here? Who is this here? But we do see that he doesn't view it as just another person copying those things, but rather that there's some type of prophetic power behind these things. So even one of the most vile leaders that Judaism has ever seen, as far as the government side goes, recognizes there's a higher power behind some of the stuff that's going on here. This is not just any regular old man. There's something going on with this. There's something behind this. We saw there in Mark that he respected John the Baptist. He listened to John the Baptist. He saw that he was a righteous and a godly man. So if this man could see that, you have to wonder how willfully blind the Pharisees and the Sadducees were at the time.
But Nebuchadnezzar saw the fire furnace and said it looks like the sun.
Right.
He was a heathen king, probably the way that should be translated, likened unto a son of God.
Right, yes, sir.
I think it's on the translation.
Right.
He knew something was going on there.
Right.
He put his finger on it. But one thing about it, he figured, they got no time with this too much.
Right.
And they Daniel and them boy. You know, kind of, peace offering.
Right.
Whatever's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
You know? Yeah, I mean, people that you think don't respect you, you'll just make a stand. I mean, you know, you like that, I'm like that, Jeff like that, we all like that. You know, we may not agree with it, we may not like it, but at least we know. You know?
Right. So he recognizes that something's there. We need to pay, or not necessarily we need to pay attention to this, but there's some things happening, and the others were just unwilling. They would not allow themselves to see it. Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night in John chapter 3 and says, "We know you've come from God. No man can do these things except God be with him. We know you are of God, and but we're not going to do anything about it. We know who you are, but we don't really want you. We don't need you. We've gotten by so far without you. We don't need this. We know who you are. Maybe even a little bit of we know what you're doing, but we're not going to obey it. We're not going to follow that. We're not going to trust that. We don't need any of that." So they willfully ignored the signs that everybody else could see.
Now, see, there's a big difference between, and I'm gonna use the term ignorant and explaining, because we use it as a derogatory
Right.
term when we're describing people's actions or attitudes. The word ignorant simply means unskilled and unlearned.
Correct.
Peter said, in reminding the brethren there about what had happened in times past, that there were those that were willingly ignorant. Now, willful carries with it a very strong, powerful conviction on your part.
Right.
Ignorant does not. Ignorant simply means you don't know. You don't know how to apply it, you don't know. But being willfully ignorant means you do know.
You know exactly what it is. Right.
Okay? You can act, and now you've made a conscious decision not to. And that's a dangerous thing dealing with the government. Agencies, some of them I dealt with,
Right.
you had several different categories of things: serious, negligent, okay, it happened, you know. Anyway, you don't ever want to cross the bridge if you will.
No.
That's criminal.
Right.
I mean, that you never, you have to be a total, I don't know, you just can't even get to that bridge,
Right.
because they will nail you. Okay? If they can prove that you knew, that you understood, but
Right.
you chose not to. That's willful.
Right.
Okay? So, you know, Peter said them folk were willingly ignorant. Okay? It's dangerous.
Verse 26 of Hebrews chapter 10. "For if we go on sinning deliberately," willfully, "after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains sacrifice for sins, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. Anyone who set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much worse punishment do you think will be deserved by the one who has trampled underfoot the Son of God, profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified, and has outraged the Spirit of grace?"
Criminal.
Right.
You're a religious criminal.
Willfully turning your back.
It's tough, man. You don't ever want to get that low.
And,
In this world, all the next.
right, the Pharisees, Sadducees, those of the day, they knew what they were doing. They saw it, they ignored it, they wanted to sweep it under the rug. They decided to have somebody get rid of the problem. And on the day of Pentecost, when those that they had whipped up into a frenzy and got to shout, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him," you know, it stands to reason that some of those exact same people were there on the day of Pentecost and cried out, "Men and brethren, what shall we do to be saved?" We didn't see all of these things happening. We didn't see Christ. We didn't see all the evidence that was laid out. This evening, as we're getting ready to come to Bible study, we had the TV on and we were watching the Artemis rocket take off to the moon. Historic. It hasn't been done in so many years. A historic event. And it was awesome to see it for myself, Also, that my children were able to see that, and they will remember those things. Can you imagine what it must have been like to see Jesus Christ? To be there in Galilee, to see that happening, to see all those miracles and those wonders and those things that were happening at the time, and all these events. Here's Jesus being baptized, and then John the Baptist is beheaded, and then Jesus is crucified. All of these things, and being there and putting those things together, piecing that together and seeing the evidence that just abounds. But yet we here, separated by some 2,000 years, can put all this evidence together, and we can see it in the mind's eye of faith, and we can believe it, and we do. Number 313 in our hymn books, we saw thee not. Without having been an eyewitness, without having been there to hear his voice, to see his works, to walk with him, to sit at his feet, we believe. And we are convicted. And that conviction is what holds us through to the end. We walk by faith and not by sight. Faith being the evidence of things hoped for, and the conviction of things not seen. If we're convicted by the message this evening to make a change in our life, whether it's to give our life to Christ through baptism, or whether it's to rededicate our life, or there's things that personally we need to make right between us and God this evening,